Thank you for joining this session on a history of racist state violence. My name is Arton Giles, and I am one of the co-secretaries of Labour Against Racism and Fascism, who are one of the half of the duo that are organising the conference this weekend on challenging state violence alongside socialists of colour. So we will wait a couple of minutes for people to start, and people to join and enter the room. And so whilst we do that, please do introduce yourselves in the chat box. You can access the chat box by clicking the chat box function at the bottom of your screen if you're on a computer. If you're on a tablet or a smartphone, by tapping your screen and then clicking the button with 3 dots or more written on it, with the word more written on it, and we'll get started in a minute. And yeah, we've had a really interesting couple of days so far discussing how to challenge state violence. I'm sure many of you would have joined some of our other panels. So thank you once again for joining this one. And yeah, please do introduce yourselves in the chat box. As has been said previously, this conference was inspired by the BLM protests, which we've seen take place on our streets in recent weeks. And when we were deciding on the session, on looking at the historical perspectives around state violence, we were contemplating calling it a history of racist state violence or histories of racist state violence. And so that's why you might have even kind of seen it advertised as both. And that's what we really wanted to explore, you know, what the dominant narratives are, be it taught in schools, represented in our mainstream media, or those that are ingrained in the British psyche. So in this session, we'll interrogate those dominant narratives, their true history, how they impact on the present, and why it's important to challenge them. And then we hope to explore and discuss exactly how we challenge these narratives through breakout rooms in the second half of the session. So do obviously stick around for that, and hopefully we will get you know, quite a practical bit of challenging these dominant narratives through the breakout sessions. Just to let everyone know, this session is being recorded, but it's not being broadcast yet, and obviously we will kind of edit out and make sure that no one will be shown. And so when the time comes for questions, do bear that in mind, and if you would rather your question wasn't kind of recorded or broadcast, then just drop me a message in the chat. I will make sure that you don't appear in any videos. So we'll hear from our speakers, but just a moment, but I just wanted to let you know a bit more about the breakout rooms and how we hope to conduct them. So we're hoping that together, after our speakers, we can come up with 3 or 4 dominant narratives that are ingrained in British society. And then each breakout group, with about 5 or 6 of us, will look at how we challenge those particular narratives. So do be thinking about what those statements could be. So for example, one that we think is definitely ingrained in the British psyche is this idea that Britain ended slavery in the 1800s after a change of heart, and then went around being the leading abolitionist, erasing the work of black abolitionists, or the resistance to those changes, or indeed the fact that slavery essentially carried on in different forms after that. So we hope that together we can come up with 3 or 4 of these dominant narratives, these statements around the history of racist state violence, and explore, with the help of our speakers, how we challenge these. So without further ado, I will introduce Dr. Nadine El-Inani, who teaches at Birkbeck School of Law and co-directs the Centre for Research on Race and Law. She is author of Bordering Britain, Law, Race and Empire, published this year by Manchester University Press, and a link to purchase that book will be posted in the chat box at the end. So over to you, Nadine.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction, Arton, and to everyone for coming today. So yeah, hopefully in what I'm going to say today, I'll kind of yeah, respond in a way to the challenge that Arton posed of kind of trying to determine what the dominant narratives are around Britain's history, what the erasures are, and how we can think about forming counter narratives to those misguided dominant discourses around Britain's history. And I'm going to focus specifically on the question of immigration law and Britain's borders in the context of its history of colonialism, and also talk a bit about slavery in thinking about how we can challenge some of the dominant narratives and violent discourses that we're hearing a lot of now. We have been obviously for a long period of time, but of course we've seen in the news a lot in relation to the Channel crossings and some of the kind of assertions that are made around who deserves entry to Britain and who deserves access to resources. So one of the things I'm interested in is how immigration law itself functions as a kind of teaching prop, because it teaches white British citizens that Britain and everything within it is rightfully theirs, and anyone else, others, are here as guests. And so what I try to do is challenge the way law has this pedagogical effect in telling people, or certain people, that they're entitled to space, resources, and opportunities, and others aren't. And the way that I try and do this is to show that British immigration and nationality law is actually an extension of British colonialism. So Britain's borders, articulated and policed via immigration laws, maintain the global racial order that was established by colonialism, whereby colonized people are dispossessed of land and resources. And they also maintain Britain as a racially and colonially configured space, even though Britain would like to think that colonialism is something in the past and that it's over. In fact, Britain remains a colonial space because of the way in which borders continue to operate externally and internally, and subject racialized poor people to disproportionate vulnerability to state and street racial terror. And so important to this is to challenge this idea that somehow the wealth that is within Britain belongs in Britain, or is rightfully in place. Because of course Britain wouldn't be the wealthy place that it is without its colonial history. Colonialism and slavery were key to its industrialization and the growth of its capitalist economy. In 1833, Britain abolished slavery only to raise the equivalent of £17 billion in compensation to be paid to British slave owners for the loss of their so-called property. The compensation scheme was the largest state-sponsored payout in British history until it was superseded by the bank bailouts of 2008. And these funds that were paid out, of course, built and infused Britain's commercial, cultural, imperial, and political institutions. The wealth that was derived from British slave ownership has, of course, not been evenly distributed in Britain. It has helped to enrich and sustain elite institutions and individuals and families, and it's sown inequality deep into the fabric of British society, making it the most unequal place in Europe. But even so, Britain's healthcare system, its welfare state, its transportation infrastructure, cultural and educational institutions, battered and unequally accessible as they are in the wake of privatization and austerity policies, are nevertheless colonially derived, along with the private wealth that has been amassed over the course of the British Empire and then retained after its defeat via systems of inheritance. And one of the most important periods in understanding the way in which Britain achieved this sort of trick of making it seem as though Britain is a legitimately bordered sovereign nation state, rather than a contested colonial space, are the 60s, 70s, and 80s, because in this period, the immigration laws and nationality laws that were passed really allowed Britain to construct itself as a post-imperial space. So the legislation that was passed in this era culminated in the 1981 British Nationality Act, which raised for the first time the idea of Britain as a post-imperial, territorially defined and circumscribed space. It severed a notionally white, geographically distinct Britain from the remainder of its colonies and the Commonwealth. And it was through the concept, a particular legal concept called patriality, which was introduced a decade earlier in the 1971 Immigration Act, that made whiteness intrinsic to British identity. So only patrials, who were defined as those born in Britain or with a parent born in Britain, had a right of abode, and so a right to enter and stay in Britain. And in 1971, when that concept was invented to achieve the aim of preventing racialized colony and Commonwealth citizens from coming to Britain and settling in Britain, a person born in Britain was 98% likely to be white. So you can see here how whiteness was written into the law. And in 1981, then, with the British Nationality Act, this process of racial exclusion was continued because British citizenship was then built on the concept of patriality as well. So citizenship, or right to British citizenship, was tied to a person who has a right of entry and abode, so a patrial. So this move was both materially and symbolically really important, because a territorially distinct Britain and a concept of citizenship that made Britishness commensurate with whiteness made it clear that Britain, the landmass and everything within it, belongs to Britons conceived intrinsically as white. So what I say is that this 1981 Nationality Act, British Nationality Act, didn't signify an end to British colonialism, but was itself a colonial maneuver, a final act of appropriation and seizure of the wealth and infrastructure that was secured through centuries of colonial conquest. And of course, it had really important effects, because this Nationality Act, along with the changes to immigration law that had already been made, put the wealth of Britain gained via colonial conquest out of reach for the vast majority of racialized people who had been dispossessed through colonial processes. And of course, immigration law, as we know, it doesn't only serve as a kind of wall or an obstruction to movement. It's also the only way in which people seeking legal status or access to resources can actually claim or gain that access. And so we have a situation where you have these regimes of legal status recognition, whereby the British authorities are determining entitlement to things like citizenship and settlement or indefinite leave to remain or refugee status, and of course all the rights and access to resources that come with that. And I like to draw an analogy here with settler colonial systems, where you know, it's a more familiar argument made in that context, the sort of injustice entailed in Indigenous people, say in Canada and Australia, having to submit to the rules and evidentiary standards of those colonial legal systems in order to have their rights to land enforced. You know, we can see this, we can make a similar argument about the way in which people with ancestral or geographical or even personal histories of British colonialism who wish to access stolen colonial wealth in Britain also have to submit to the rules and evidentiary standards of the colonial power of Britain through the standards of and the requirements and the criteria set out by immigration and nationality law, and of course the heavy costs that come with engaging in that legal process. And so what you get is this facade of racial inclusion, where you have these paths to legal status recognition, which dole out immigration status to select racialized people who can fulfill certain criteria. And meanwhile, of course, the majority of racialized people are prevented from accessing Britain through the operation of both external and internal borders. And I think it's important to make this critique of law as well, that any kind of bestowal or extension of British subjecthood or citizenship as it's in its current guise can never really be seen as anything other than a colonial act. If we think about the era of the British Empire, British subjecthood was held up as the superior category, and if you were granted British subjecthood, you somehow had these civilizing benefits that flowed from that. But of course, we know that the reality is that British colonialism was genocide, mass murder, slavery, dispossession, resource and labor extraction, all predicated on the idea of white British supremacy. And even so-called free British subjects who sought to move to different parts of the empire were met with racist immigration laws in places like Canada and Australia, for example. And whenever it suited the British government, it has always treated its subjects as aliens for legal purposes, evicting them from the scope of legal protection. And of course, we saw this very recently with the effect of the hostile environment policy, which denied many of the Windrush generation and their children access to healthcare, housing, and other vital resources, and of course led to their detention and expulsion and death in some cases. And so what I would say is that we need to work towards a kind of a movement towards a different language, a challenging of the language of law, because as we've seen, the way in which the language of the law is mobilized, particularly in relation to people who are seeking to travel to Britain in a so-called illegal manner, you see the way in which legal categories actually themselves produce and legitimize racial violence. So if we think about the way in which the irregularized migrant is spoken about and treated, if those individuals who fall outside, say, the legal category of a refugee or a citizen, are made to be particularly vulnerable and put at risk of removal, of dying on their journeys to safety, of even if they do reach Britain, they can be denied access to healthcare, housing, work, and be left in destitution with sometimes fatal consequences. So it's important, I think, for us to think about challenging the language of the law in our efforts to move towards a politics of migrant solidarity and racial justice. It's not really something that the law, because of the way in which it's categorizes people into groups of those who are deserving and those who aren't, can really help us with. And of course, legal status, as we know, doesn't really change the way in which racialized people are then constructed or seen in white spaces as being undeserving. Because of course, one of the effects of the changes to law in the 70s and 80s of saying that only patrials are British or can be in Britain is that people who were not white were seen as, well, their presence was constantly questioned and has been in question ever since. And so what we need to be thinking about is kind of trying to reframe our understanding, let's say, of a process like irregularized immigration, maybe thinking about it instead as actually part of a long history of anti-colonial struggle. And that's not to say, oh, people should be placing themselves in danger, or that that's something that I'm advocating. Of course, that's not the case. It's more changing our discourse and changing our understanding and conceptualization and the way in which we speak about people who seek to travel to Britain, who don't have a visa in hand and don't have the luxury of coming by plane. You know, we need to be seeing this movement as part of a long history of anti-colonial struggle, and we need to be really imbibing that and using it in our language as a way of challenging the discourse that frames them as illegal and not entitled and queue jumping, etc., etc. So I think that's what I would kind of try to encourage, is that we imbibe this sort of counter pedagogy to that of immigration law and bordering, reject the violence of legal categorization, and kind of think about how we can move towards more empowering and redistributive radical politics of justice, and thinking about you know, not really waiting for the law to kind of step in and rule on people's entitlement, and kind of thinking that the law is just something that fell from the sky and sort of fairly determines who's entitled to access to the basic means of life, but actually ourselves changing our language and coming together and thinking about how we can think about what we can do in terms of migrant solidarity that doesn't sort of that doesn't rest on what the law determines to be the way forward in terms of who is deserving of access to resources and who isn't. Thanks.
Sorry, my microphone was muted. Thank you very much, Nadine. I certainly learned a lot from that, and I think the way, especially at the end, where you're talking about kind of reframing, you know, that struggle as part of the wider anti-colonial struggle, I think is actually, you know, particularly for the left, is something that we really do need to take on board, and I'll certainly be buying a copy of your book today. So thank you very much for that, and hopefully, you know, we can in the breakout groups draw onto some of that stuff and about how it's impacted today and how we challenge it and challenge that language and challenge those laws. So thank you. We're now grateful to be joined by Joshua Verosami, who's an artist, a writer, and a political organizer whose work intersects across a variety of different campaigns, including previously organising with Occupy and currently with Black Lives Matter UK. Joshua uses writing, film, music, and direct action to educate, agitate, and organise towards social change. And yeah, thank you for joining us this morning, Josh. Over to you.
I have no idea where you found that bio. I don't even know. Maybe it's a really old one, but it's nice. It's very generous. Must have written it when I was feeling good about myself. Thank you for inviting me to join this session. It's looked really dope, and I look forward to catching up on all of the things that I've missed over a couple of days, but it looks really dope. And it was really good to hear you, Nadine, speak about those regimes and the kind of false narratives that emerge and how we might combat it as well. And I'm looking forward to the breakout groups and hopefully some juicy discussions about what the kind of major narratives, like dominant false narratives, are and how we need to fight against them in this movement. So I was invited to kind of speak a little bit about how we might combat these dominant narratives. But I wanted to speak briefly about the dominant narratives themselves and what like false common sense emerges, and then how we might combat these narratives. And I think in terms of how we do that, it's a bit of the new and a bit of the old. So the ruling class trades in ideology dressed up as common sense. And very few people, I mean, thinking like about where I come from and the communities I live in, very few people would expound the kind of like ideological commitment to the role of police or immigration regimes in criminal justice. But the myth making, the dominant narratives that kind of go on and on, slowly leave a residue, which becomes a kind of common sense to be found everywhere. And I think about my dad, who was an immigrant, and his family came, my family are immigrants, and he has the kind of tenacity, I say that maybe because tenacity is maybe the wrong word, but he kind of has a very like a xenophobic approach when talking about immigration. And that for me is that kind of that residue of common sense, that kind of drip feed that leaves an impression over time in his mind. And it builds a narrative around the deserving and the undeserving, which Nadine spoke about. And it's very important for this conversation to think about who is deserving of state violence, whether that's through surveillance, police, prisons, sectioning, or who is deserving of public funds, as Nadine spoke about. There's a crisis of people who have no recourse to public funds in this country, and so on. And so I think about this story a couple of years ago, this thing that happened to me when I was going through Leicester Square. So I was walking through Leicester Square and it was really busy and bustling, and this older guy was trying to walk through, and he was getting kind of squashed. So I moved out the way and I was like, "Oh, here you go, brother." And then he turns around and he goes, "I'm not your brother, you head chopping Muslim bastard." And I was just like, "Rah, that's a bit mad. We need to have a little conversation." So I go to him, let's go to the side for a second, let's have a bit of a talk. And I wanted to understand, like what happened for him to get to that point where he felt so empowered to say that to me in the middle of the street. So I started to try and find some common ground between us and maybe some similarities in the lives we've lived. And it was very hard. He was quite like, he felt quite strongly that he had a good understanding of why Muslims are a threat to society and how they don't want to conform to British values, etc., etc. But over time, we began to beat it back a bit, and he began to talk about, his community and where he grew up and when he kind of thought things changed in his mind. And it was really interesting. I didn't expect it. I was just having a conversation, really. I was trying to just get under his skin and understand. But it surprised me that he was like, where he went to, because he was like, he spoke about how eventually over time, as he got older, his social circles kind of shrank, and he found himself kind of chilling more and more with a similar crew at his pub. And he spoke about how like over the course of like years, just having the TV on and having these guys have conversations and seeing the paper around him, like he felt that he kind of bought into these ideas, and it became a kind of common sense for him. So this common sense, it hegemonizes, it becomes mainstream. And I think it's important to remember that it becomes mainstream and becomes a hegemony in our social spaces, right? It's in our kind of churches, in our schools, in our workplaces, in our homes, on the street, where this stuff becomes a common sense. and then in our minds, it is able to verify and accommodate the news. You know, it may be in the beginning, we might have a kind of different common sense, a sense of solidarity from living in working class communities that might, you know, what Paul Gilroy calls this conviviality, and we might have a sense of trying to camaraderie in the shared living circumstance. But over time, we might not want to kind of combat what the news says or question it, and then we can just accommodate things like, you know, I think it was the day before yesterday, that 21-year-old kid who was the accomplice of the terrorist bomber who got 55 years, or it can accommodate when we hear Piers Morgan talking about black on black crime and the need to kind of reinforce this thin blue line, and all the kind of stuff that comes with that, and the heavy policing that we've seen over the last 10 years. And then, you know, and to accommodate that, there's the Bobby on the beat myth, you know, this kind of, you know, to accommodate the idea of the thin blue line, there's this idea of the police kind of being there to just break up fights and strike up conversation with the elderly. And I remember like the police coming into my school when I was young. We used to have like a kind of local police officer who, I don't know if you had that in any of the school you was in. It'd be interesting to know, because I've heard sometimes that's the case, but I hear obviously now that more and more there's police actually working in schools, but we had like a local police officer that would come and introduce himself to the school. And it was a really weird thing. Like he'd come in and he'd be like, he would just kind of speak about what the police does, and like, you know, how we can take care of ourselves when we're on the street, and just kind of trying to give us these kind of like good tips about how to be a careful citizen. And he creates this idea, and he, for me, very much framed the idea of what the police do, which is this kind of good guy, Bobby on the beat, just trying to protect the, you know, the regular citizen. And I think maybe it's good to kind of think about how all of that common sense making kind of obscures history, right? And Nadine spoke about the obfuscation of like colonial regimes of immigration, how that's a continued line that comes up to today. I think the same is true of the police, right? Like Robert Peel was the Irish secretary for the British government, and he's a very important figure in British history, but he sets up this, at the time when the age of revolutions, when things are really kicking up across the world, and when there's a lot of rebellion in Ireland, he comes up with this experiment called the Irish Constabulary police force. So he sets this up in order to repress the nationalist rebellions. And it's quite successful as a police force. And accompanying that police force, he sets up something called Special Branch, which works very hard. It's a very political wing of the police, and works very hard to undermine the political organizing of those movements. And it works very well, and he gets praised for it, and it does its job over there. And then many years later, not so many years later, but maybe several years later, he becomes the Home Secretary. And facing a similar wave of rebellions on home soil, he then looks to that experiment that he produced several years ago and does the same thing here. And like, there's comments about how, in terms of legislation, it was exactly the same stuff that was used for instituting the police in Ireland that was used to institute the police here. And also, of course, the Special Branch is instituted, that very political wing of the police is instituted here and gets to work immediately undermining especially industrial left-wing organising and monitoring Irish migrants. And it's interesting to think how Special Branch was doing that then, you know, centuries ago, and Special Branch does that now in terms of monitoring migrant communities and activists and Muslim communities and inner city quote-unquote gangs. So the gaze of the Special Branch has always been on kind of marginalized communities. I'm the co-host now. Okay, sure. And Conor Woodman's a really good guy for kind of, because I'm not going to be able to go into and expound all of this kind of thinking around what some people call the kind of imperial boomerang. But Conor Woodman does this really well for a 5-part series on Verso. And I'd also, if you're thinking about organizing, I'd also recommend reading his article, The Infiltrator and the Movement, which looks at how Special Branch has always worked to undermine our political organizing. And it's quite shocking. And some of you might have seen the article, I think it came out last year, or like the kind of reportage that The Guardian did, I think it came out last year, maybe the year before, about how Special Branch and the different kind of political apparatus that our intelligence services have set up have been monitoring over 1,000 activist groups since the 1950s. And I remember in his article, there was a really, I don't know, sometimes I'm like, read it, but sometimes I'm like, don't read it, because it might be like, it might just dishearten you. But there's a bit in there where where he talks about how there was a point in time where MI5 and Special Branch had tabs on 90% of the membership of the Communist Party of Great Britain. And they had 2 staffers in there that had been working for over 2 decades. So, and that had a very chilling effect, of course, on that organization and on social movements on the whole. So it's really important to think about that kind of continued line, because of course intelligence agencies were also a colonial boomerang, and they were set up. Well, MI5 specifically had traced its lineage to the Anglo-Boer Wars, and all of that experimentation begins in the colonies and comes back to Britain. And it's very, very powerful for us to be able to counter dominant narratives around, them just having like a kind of an innocent role in protecting citizens, when in fact, of course, in reality, it just protects the ruling class. So how do we combat these dominant narratives? I'm tempted to say I have no clear answers, but there's a lot of thinking around it, and I want to jump forward for a second on some of my notes, but actually no, I'll stay where I was. So I've been writing, and part of that is trying to approach this Marxist intellectual that I know has like a big canon of work, and I kind of know it through reading what other people have written about him, but I'm trying to engage with his work, and his name's Gramsci, and I'm sure all of you know him. But he talks about these 2 phases of class conflict, the war of maneuver and the war of position. And the war of maneuver is kind of like what people understand as like a revolutionary conflict, is the direct clashes between revolutionaries and the state. And it's not what I want to focus on in these 2 theories is the war position. And the war position is kind of the imperative to take a battle to ideological apparatus, ideology where they appear in ideological apparatus. So it's like a war of narratives. It's about battling ideology where it appears, whether it's in the church, whether it's in the school, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's on the street corner, or in the union. It's about building counter-hegemonic narratives where they appear. And it's a strategic attempt to undermine these where they appear. So, and often through organization. But I think, and it's interesting for me to read this, and I'm just coming to this stuff because I see it as a very like when I'm reading it, I'm like, this is a very scientific approach to combating dominant narratives. It's like, here's this idea of like a very structured, like frontal war. And I feel like it's quite different to what I see in terms of a lot of how we talk about challenging dominant narratives, because I feel like when we talk about that, how do we challenge dominant narratives? It can end up feeling a bit discursive, and it can accommodate like the idea that we do that through trading and hot takes on social media to what is largely an extended echo chamber. Or we do that by, increasingly I see that as understood as like undertaking an air war and trying to put as many spokespersons as we can into the mainstream media to challenge dominant narratives in that place solely. And for me, an air war, in particular, trying to challenge dominant narratives on the mainstream media, for me, is a war of attrition that we just can't win. Like, of all the places where we want to take, where we want to challenge dominant narratives, the airwaves is not where we're going to win anytime soon. But for some reason, that's become, for some reason, but also I think there's a lot of reasons that I won't go into now, that has become kind of a lot of what we think about when we try and challenge dominant narrative. Just let me jump forward a bit, because I know I'm taking quite a bit of time. So I recently listened to this podcast that was really good yesterday, actually. So these are all very fresh ideas, and you have to bear with me. It's a really cool podcast on the dig, and it's called Organizing for Power, Organizing to Win, I think it's called. And it's with a group called Philadelphia Youth United for Change. And they've recently, kind of, I think last year, maybe released a book called You're Trying to Win or Nah. And this organization was kind of like set up several years ago, had an implosion around 2015, 2016, when social movements had a boom because there was lots of, there was the kind of Black Lives Matter movements on the streets. And when I was listening to them, I was kind of thinking there's so many like similarities with grassroots groups and social movement spaces here in terms of like the kind of carousel of of uprisings and how groups kind of boom and then they have these internal contradictions and then they kind of fall away. And it was really good to hear them speak about how they prize evaluation. And actually I was thinking, and this is me going off on a tangent, but if we kind of did more evaluation in our organizations in moments of crisis and thought about how we can become better, we might just actually bounce back in terms of constantly folding. And all of us have seen so many groups and organizations come up and then fade away. But they kind of put a lot of their success in kind of coming back to PE classes. And when I first saw PE classes, which was like earlier this year, I was like, PE classes? Because the Black Panthers talk about PE classes as well. I was like, is this some kind of like physical education for the revolution that these groups did? But it's political education classes. And that's one of the most important parts of Philadelphia Youth United for Change. Building, and this is like an inner city kind of like Black and brown working class youth group, you know? But for them, building a kind of like historical materialist understanding of the world, building a dialectical tradition within like the group about how they kind of think about the apparatus that appears in their communities, the institutions that appear in their communities, trying to like take a really rigorous approach to thinking through why these things exist and how they affect their lives and how they might defy them and overcome them is part of their work. And they're heavily inspired by Amilcar Cabral, who I also find very inspiring, because he writes a lot about it, and I really recommend going and reading his work, because he thinks a lot about how do we challenge these dominant narratives through political organization and through developing new culture. And critical pedagogy is an important part of that, and PE class is an important part of that. And there's a really good video of Fred Hampton, part of the Chicago Black Panthers, talking about how in order to become a member of the Black Panthers, you needed to go through 7 weeks of PE classes. So yeah, it was a very important part for them. And it wasn't simply like one-off events or event series, but a sustained, and this is what I think is missing, right? I think our organizations need to do more sustained, place-based, programmatic educational work. So, which instills that primary instinct that that the Philadelphia Youth United such a mouthful. Youth United for Change in Philadelphia speak about that kind of that primary instinct of a socialist, which is to dialectically interrogate what's around us. And so through doing that, through place-based work, we can build organizations, we can elevate community consciousness, basically. We can develop, hopefully, in organizations, a cadre of leaders that are able to kind of empower people in their workplaces, in their communities, to interrogate their lives and to begin to understand. And of course, it's like a symbiotic relationship to begin to understand, that one that's just been dropped in the chat, to understand the world we live in. And I think about like, earlier today I was watching a video of Ella Baker. It's really cool. It's a new video that was uploaded. It's on this this YouTube channel called Afro Marxist. Again, I'd really recommend watching it because it has actual videos of Ella Baker speaking, which is really dope because she's like rad. And she kind of speaks about this, how she got politicized when she was young. This kid comes up to her and calls her a nigger, and she like knocks him the fuck out. And she's like, that was good, and it was great to do that, but we're not going to win by like these individual knockouts. We need to build an organization. And it was interesting for me to hear her say that, because I've been watching a lot of Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, some people might know him as, and a lot of what in terms of him talking about political strategy and combating dominant narratives. And he says that the only way we can really do that is through building organization. And yeah, and so to hear Ella Baker say that, I was like, oh, okay, he gets it from her. But what I'm trying to say here is like, we need to do this kind of building educational programs and combating dominant narratives through political organization. The more we do it through like individual instances or this series here or this thing there, like we're not going to build up the kind of consciousness and power that we need in our communities. And I had a whole other section about like the specific things we might do like what kind of traditions we can call upon in terms of like how the Black Panthers set up the paper, or how the like East London Federation of Suffragettes set up the Workers' Dreadnought, or what SNCC was doing. But I want to kind of, I think I've been going on for quite a while, so I'll end it there.
Thank you very much, Josh. That was yeah, there was really a lot in there, and I think it really obviously complemented and like, especially what you were saying about, you know, I mean, I think what you were saying about the airways is something that, yeah, I've been thinking about. It's like, it's just a war of attrition, but thank you so much for that. There was a lot in there, and I think that's really gonna help us, or both what yourself and what Nadine was saying in these breakout groups that we're going to go into. So we're going to jump into 3 different rooms and have a bit of a discussion about how to challenge specific narratives, and then obviously we'll come back together at the end and kind of have a bit of discussion about what was said in the breakout groups, as well as kind of any questions that come out of that to our speakers. Hopefully we'll get some time at the end to go to that. So what I would like, as we said at the beginning, to almost ask you guys what you think are the kind of dominant narratives in British history, kind of ingrained in the British psyche. There was one example that I gave earlier, so we'll probably use that as one of the breakout groups, but please do type in the chat box kind of a statement that you think, you know, needs to be challenged, such as the one that we were using earlier was this idea that, oh, there's lots of bad police forces around the world, but the British aren't one of them. We're policed by consent. The British cops are the good guys, and kind of so it's looking at how we challenge that, and I think, you know, obviously what Josh was saying about reminding us, you know, about how the police force was established, about what it was in Ireland, and how that then obviously used to police working class movements and socialist movements here. You know, it's really relevant. So no worries, Danny, thanks for joining us. Sorry, I just saw it in that chat, but yeah, please do type in the chat any statements that you feel you know, are kind of dominant in the British psyche, and that need to be challenged, and we'll go and discuss kind of specifically how we can challenge those. And what we'll hopefully find when we come back is the kind of similarities between the things that need to be done to challenge the different statements in different parts of society. So please do use the chat box to type any statements that you feel are dominant and need to be challenged, and a version of history is put forward that we know is untrue, is patently untrue, but that has led to the kind of beliefs of you know, the majority of British people, as it were. Okay, I'm gonna come up with another one, which we've got here. So the British Empire lifted backwards people out into the modern age, and went around, going around as a force for good, as a civilizing force. So that's a narrative that you know, is ingrained in lots of people's minds, and so we'll use that for kind of breakout room 2. And if anyone, yeah, right, exactly. And so that's I'm sorry, I'm just looking at the chat. Exactly, Marto, Max. So that, I think we're going to be looking at that statement in the second group, right? And definitely we'll be looking at how we challenge that, obviously through education, and so lots, you know, we will, I'm sure, kind of be talking about how we challenge that through, you know, decolonizing the curriculum, etc., but also through, you know, other ways that we can do it, through arts and culture, and any other ways that we can think. And you know, when we were kind of doing this session, we were kind of obviously it was around the time we started planning it, around the time that the Bristol statue of Edward Colston, slave owner and trader, was toppled down by protesters during the BLM protests there, and we were kind of thinking, you know, how effective is that as a way of challenging these dominant state narratives around state violence. And perhaps that's something that a speaker or our speakers could pick up on at the end. The last statement that we're going to have is Britain ended slavery in the 1800s after a change of heart and then went around being the leading abolitionist around the world. So we're going to use those 3 statements and 3 different breakout rooms and spend about 10 minutes discussing them before we come back. So just to go over again, the first one is the British police force are better than other police forces around the world, and I'll be taking that breakout group. The breakout room 2 will be the British Empire lifted backwards people out into the modern age and had that role of a civilizer. And the last one, breakout room 3, will be Britain entered slavery in the 1800s after a change of heart and then went around being the leading abolitionist. And Pol will be doing that one. We'll see if we can get people into their preferred groups, and we'll have about 8 of us per room. So give us a second, we'll go into that, and then we will come back in about 10 minutes. Hey everyone, welcome back. Hopefully that's everyone back with us, and apologies that we are running a bit over, but I'll let, who's feeding back from group 2? Is that Josh or someone else? Will, are you feeding back for your group?
Yep, yeah, cool. Yeah, so we were talking about kind of this narrative that the kind of like the British changed, like abolished slavery because they'd had a change of heart and they did the right thing. We talked about some of the reasons that, you know, actually was with our understanding basically being that, you know, the biggest driver was that slavery was no longer really profitable for the UK. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of obviously still this big dominant narrative amongst Brits nowadays. Kind of speaks to this kind of white savior complex of Britain going around and fixing everyone's problems. We came up with a couple of like reasons for it. I mean, obviously, like we talked about everyone's time at school and how it's like not really talked about in the curriculum or in we actually differ between different members of the group, but certainly Faheen said that she had challenged the like kind of brushing over of colonialism in one of her classes, and had been basically dismissed. So yeah, we talked about like how well obviously it'd be great if we could get it into the curriculum somehow, but also in ways that we could in other ways we could affect like improving education in this way. So we talked about like maybe kind of there were various community groups that people knew about, and sort of like trying to teach these kind of things through these community groups as well. We had some questions about how you achieve like a far-reaching effect with this kind of thing, because I don't know about everyone else, but I wasn't engaged with too many community groups growing up. So it'd be interesting to hear if anyone's got any ideas of how you do achieve like a far reach just working within community groups. And the last thing we talked about was how kind of a lot of people have been educating themselves on these kind of things recently, due to kind of like big gestures they've seen. So there was the Colston statue being brought down, and kind of this has prompted a lot of conversation around this subject and causing a lot of people to like educate themselves in this way.
Great, thank you very much for that, Will. That was really comprehensive, and sounds like that group had some really good discussions. And yeah, that's a really interesting question. Hopefully we'll have time to come back to that after the feedback from the next group. Who's doing that?
Which group are you referring to, Artin?
So not my one. I think it was group.
Oh, you doing?
Yeah, yourself.
Group 2. Okay, so that was my group. Does anyone from my group want to give a summary? If no one comes forward, I can do it. That's fine. So yeah, our statement was the British Empire lifted backward people out into the modern age, and I think that a lot of those conversations were around education and infrastructure. Education I didn't really see coming, but I probably should have. I think there was this, we had this far-reaching discussion, quite good actually, on what that kind of meant, how maybe the ideas of empire tied into the perceived prestige of British education. And you know, one sort of way in which that's expressed is through a curriculum, and on the way that a lot of post-colonial countries still use British standards and compare their education system to the British education system as a gold standard almost. And another was in the language. We had Nadine give us an excellent kind of, and other people give us an excellent point about the different way in which different events are recorded. The difference between what might be described in the British history textbook as a mutiny and what might be described in other countries as kind of a rebellion or a revolution, or, you know, the difference in language being on the kind of moral dimension of the oppressed people, where you see them as kind of delinquent in a mutiny, for example, or kind of seeking kind of natural righteous justice in a kind of a rebellion or a revolution. I also thought kind of there were some very interesting points. I think trains and infrastructure in India go together in almost any conversation. You know, trains really are one of the defining themes. There was a lot of discussion about kind of addressing one of the more dominant narratives in how the British Empire relates to India, which is that they added the train system, and that's one of the, because it's such a backbone of India now, that it really is the kind of linchpin between saying that. But one of our members, I think it was Joseph actually, kind of said, well, we could compare India to Japan and say that, you know, Japan shows that, you know, non-European countries can develop trains system and infrastructure, and they don't need to be colonized to be introduced to the technology of trains, which I thought was quite an interesting point. You know, whatever you think about other Japanese interventions, that one certainly is. And finally, the last point I'm going to make is about, you know, World War II. We obviously, you know, mentioned things like the Bengal famine, but also the notion of how we relate to Churchill, something I personally feel quite strongly on as well. And I think the best way for us to understand Churchill is as a protectionist rather than an anti-fascist. To say that Churchill's anti-fascist in any way kind of obscures what all of his goals really were. You know, it wasn't just that he wanted to beat Hitler. He wanted to protect the interests of British capital, look for ways to exploit oil after the war, which is one of the ways that we saw, which is one way that we can understand how kind of post-war relations kind of panned out. So yeah, I'm just going to end on that really. Seeing Churchill as a protectionist and making the case that actually he's really just an aggressive protectionist rather than anti-fascist. Thanks.
Great, thank you for that, Josh. And yeah, I'm conscious that we're running short on time and already obviously going over, and we do really want to hear from our speakers for some closing comments. So I'm going to be quite quick with this feedback and basically say ACAB no. I think that we spoke about kind of how do we relate firstly, we spoke about how do we relate kind of personal experiences, and realised that, you know, everyone, you know, most people who've had a run-in with police, it wouldn't have ended well, obviously, if they were on one side of it, but also, you know, in a lot of cases, police don't help victims, don't help survivors, and it's about kind of relating that personal experience and using that to kind of challenge this notion that the police are protectors and the police are good. We also spoke, you know, kind of related to what Josh was saying about in the media, we did luckily have Josh in our group, and so that was really helpful, and kind of speaking about the kind of war of attrition in the media and how do we make that whole cultural shift. And then Hasib made a really good point around, we can't be kind of waiting for these moments like the death of George Floyd to try and kind of raise that mass consciousness, or how do we do it? How do we do it without obviously the brutal racist murder of a man kind of having that spark? And then Josh came in with a really good point about we need to have that alternative ready when we talk about things like defund the police or abolish the police, and that alternative needs to be there, and about the context of different communities, and about in one place it'll be kind of more fertile ground for an abolitionist movement against the police, and in other places as he said, you'll get slapped in the face. And so it's about having both that kind of ideological perspective, but also having that pragmatic perspective to be able to relate to lots of different people that we need to in order to build this movement, and in order to challenge this dominant narrative. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there, and I'm also going to ask for Nadine and then Joshua to come back with some final comments, if that's all right, and if we can help kind of address maybe a bit of that question about that was raised in the discussion group about how effective kind of community organizations educating in the community and how to have that far-reaching effect. That would be great, but I'll hand over to Nadine first, if that's all right, and then Josh to close.
Thanks, Atin. I mean, I don't have much to add to the really excellent summaries that we heard from the people feeding back from the breakout rooms, and the discussion that we had, I felt was so useful. And I guess with discussions like that, you sort of feel with these that you just want a bit more time to actually be able to kind of put your finger on what some of those strategies might be, and actually kind of do some of that work of thinking through what that might entail in terms of strategies. But I felt yeah, and I felt also like I was missing out in a way on the discussions in the other breakout rooms, because it sounds like they were also really helpful, and that we do need to kind of connect these dots and draw them together a bit. And I'm conscious of time, so I think I'd like to leave it there with the summaries that we had, and yeah, I hope that we can also come back to some of these spaces. I think of all of the online events that I've done, and there've been so many in this period, the ones that I found most helpful have actually involved this element of workshopping or breakout, where you actually get to kind of not just sort of have a panel format where you just sit and talk and then everyone sort of goes away, asks you questions, but you actually get to talk to each other, because everyone participating in these events have things that are so helpful and useful to say. And I learned a lot, and I hope that we can do kind of more events like this where we're actually workshopping some of these things, so we can begin to move from ideas, which are really, really helpful, to kind of thinking about strategy and organizing collectively. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you. That was yeah. Thanks for that contribution, and thanks for staying with us for the workshop. And yeah, hopefully we can do more of this together. And I'll just come to Joshua for some final comments before I come back.
Thank you. I also don't have that much to add. I feel like we covered so much ground in the conversations in the breakout, and hearing the feedback, it sounds like a lot of ground was covered. I guess the only thing I'll add is like an observation and a thought, which is like hearing the feedback from the conversations, talking about those dominant narratives and how in some ways we might combat it. For me, it feels like there's no shortage of understanding from lived experience and from analytical understanding of some of the issues we face. It might not be the most fleshed out and the most rigorous, and there's always more work being done on it. But there's not a situation of not having enough. And also, like, through seeing events like these and knowing how many people have attended throughout the thing, and knowing that this is an event in a long line, as Nadine says, there's been so many events across this period. For me, being partaking in some of them and knowing about them also says to me that we don't have a shortage of people. We don't have a shortage of like cadre and people who are willing to do the work and who have done the work. So kind of like, for me, it's like, what next? Like, what do we do with this kind of understanding and with this amount of people and with this crisis on our hands? And I just come back to that. And again, I just really want to plug that podcast on the dig radio with the Youth United for Change, because I feel like they're thinking through that, like, what do we do now? And I think a lot of it comes back to what there's been an absence of doing, which is building organization. And I know we've done a lot of, we invested a lot into building organization at the time of the electoral campaign, but this kind of educational work needs to be programmatic, it needs to be sustained, it needs to be in the community, and it needs to be linked to a political organization where people can go and stay and grow and lead. So yeah, I'm really excited for where we take these, because there's such a demand and there's such an urgency to do this work in the places where we live. And yeah, holla.
Nice one. Thank you very much, Josh, and thank you very much, Nadine. That was I think yeah, it was a really good session, I think, and I think the workshops, the discussions were really good, and I think, you know, I took a lot away from that, and hopefully everyone else did. So I know we're going over, so I'll keep this very short, just to let you know about some of the other events that we've got coming up, and particularly, obviously, you know, as Nadine was saying, we do need more time to discuss these strategies. So at 1:30 p.m. today, we've got our workshop on strategies for resistance, and that's with Suresh Grover from the Monitoring Organisation and Akram Solhov from Migrants Organised. And then at 3:30 in the afternoon, we have our panel on BLM building the movement, and that will be looking at how we as leftists or socialists can support the Black Lives Matter movement nationally, as well as kind of locally in our communities through kind of smaller community groups. So please do join us for that. Also, as has been posted in the chat, all the links that Josh has mentioned, as well as the link to Nadine's new book, Bordering Britain, Race, Empire and Law, and by Manchester University Press. The link to that is in the chat, and we'll also be sending out a kind of bigger document as a follow-up with all the links and any actions, as well as to join our mailing list and to join our organising Slack. And if we've missed any links from either Josh or Nadine, we'll include that in there. So please do have a look at that chat. Thank you for joining us. Do join the other sessions. The links to those will be posted in the chat now, and hopefully see you later on. But I'll leave the call running for just a minute so you can get any links that you need. But yeah, big thank you to Joshua Verosami and to Dr. Nadine El Inani, and to our facilitators and volunteers for those breakout rooms and for finding those links during the discussions and posting them in the chat. So thank you, everyone, and I hope you'll join us for our next sessions later.